Today's lesson is going to focus on a couple of different topics. First is the literary term irony, which we'll take a look at the three different types of irony and also see some examples. And then the other subject is the Cask of Amontillado, which is a short story written by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, some of you may be familiar with Edgar Allan Poe's work, such as The Raven and Telltale Heart and The House of Usher. And so you might have an idea of what Edgar Allan Poe's stories are like. Personally, this is one of my favorite short stories that we read, but it is also one of the more difficult short stories that we read. So it is really important that you understand it, and that's why I wanted to create a lesson for you to help you better understand it, so while you're reading, maybe you won't struggle as much. So let's start off just breaking down the title. What is a cask? This story is called The Cask of Amontillado. Well, what is a cask? A cask is a wooden barrel or container. You've probably seen one before. It is a large wooden canister that normally contains alcohol. The word comes from the Spanish cascara, which means tree bark, in the sense that the bark surrounds and holds the tree in the way that a cask surrounds and holds wine. All right, so that's what a cask is. Let's talk about what Amontillado is. Amontillado is a type of wine. It's a pale, dry sherry. So when we say the Cask of Amontillado, we're talking about a large wooden container full of wine. Amontillado is named after the Montilla region of Spain, where this style of wine originated in the 18th century. This is a very rare form of wine, and so when we're reading our story, you'll see that it is obviously a focal point that this rare wine is going to have a big emphasis on the plot. Let's talk about our setting. This is the setting of our story is the Carnival season in Italy. Those of you that are not very familiar with Carnival, in the United States, we more commonly know it as Mardi Gras. New Orleans, Mardi Gras, Mobile, Alabama, the coast, Mississippi Gulf Coast all celebrate Mardi Gras. It is tied to the Catholic religion, and it is the celebration before Lent, and the time of year is early spring, February, March time period. And so Carnival is a huge celebration where people get together, dress in costumes. They have parades. They dance in the street. There's lots of music, a lot of partying, a lot of drinking, a lot of eating good food. And so Carnival is a big deal, not only in the United States with the Mardi Gras, but around the world as well. And so the last note I have here is people often dress up or masquerade. Masquerade is another term for wearing a mask and dressing in a costume. And so if you've ever seen the movie Rio about the blue parrot, there are a lot of mentions of Carnival happening in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And here's some more information about Carnival. And like I said, it mentioned in Brazil is one of the largest Carnival celebrations. And here's a few more pictures that you can look at of all the different costumes, and these are more traditional costumes that are worn during Carnival today, but they would have been very similar to the time setting of our story, which would have been around in the 17th century. All right, another setting of our story is the catacombs. Now, what are catacombs? Catacombs are a network of caves that are used for burial of the dead. So in our story, part one of the settings will be the Carnival party, but the setting will then move into the catacombs. Now, why are there catacombs? Well, in large populated cities where there's not very much ground, the cities would have these network of caves in which they could bury people. Now, if you were a wealthy person, you would have your own burial spot. But if you're a poor person, you would just kind of be thrown into sort of a mass grave type situation. So could be very scary, very dark. Obviously, our story is going to take place in the 17th century, so no electricity, and I would not want to be in the catacomb at night for obvious reasons. So like I mentioned, there would have been no electricity during the time of our story, and so one of the things that was used was something called a flambeau, which is basically a torch, a stick on fire that would be used to basically as like a flashlight during this time period, so you could travel through the catacombs where it would be very dark. Then you might have a few candles or flambeau spots where you could light flambeaus as you go, but most of the time you would carry around the flambeau on a stick and just take it with you as you walk through the catacombs. All right, let's talk about mood. Let's get into some more specific parts of the story. We talked about the setting, and I explained the meaning of what the Cask of Amontillado is, but let's talk about the mood of this story. Those of you familiar with Edgar Allan Poe stories know that his mood is often kind of creepy, very dark, very gothic. Those are all be good words to describe Edgar Allan Poe's mood in his stories. But why do we have mood? How does an author convey mood to us? It's an emotion evoked in the reader by a piece of writing. And so an author will often use different descriptive details to describe to us the mood that he wants to convey. If he wants us to be scared, he will use language that will make us scared. If he wants us to be excited, he'll use language that will make us excited. And so the mood of this story, again, is going to be very dark, sinister, creepy. And so here's an example. We walk down the hallway. That doesn't really tell us any type of mood that we would need, but here's that same sentence written in a different way. We crept down the long, dark hallway. And so with that sentence, you see that there's this kind of suspenseful, sneaky creepiness that's going on with how they use the words crept instead of walked, and long, dark to describe the hallway. All right, so now let's discuss a little term, irony. And I think that most of you are familiar with irony, but it's also one of the most misidentified literary terms. Irony is the result of a contrast between appearance or expectation and reality. A lot of times authors will do this because they want to achieve a certain effect on the reader. So going back to mood, irony could be used to achieve that mood of sneakiness or suspensefulness. And so, we'll look at the three different types of irony and hopefully get you ready when you read the Cask of Amontillado to be able to identify some of those different types of irony. Start with verbal irony. This is probably the one type of irony most of you are familiar with. It's called sarcasm. And these are when words are used to suggest the opposite of what is meant. So those of you that are familiar with sarcasm, you know that when you speak, you don't actually mean what you say. And so, no, I didn't study for the test. Using that sarcastic tone. And so this can be sometimes difficult for authors to relay to the reader. But if used correctly, verbal irony can be very, very powerful. Dramatic irony. Let's talk about dramatic irony. And here I have what I think is a good example of dramatic irony. This is when what appears to be true to a character is not what the reader or audience knows to be true. And so you can see here in the cartoon that I put, you've got this cat putting some pepper into a bowl, and the fish bowl is on the stove. And one of the fish says to the other, "First he warms our bowl, now he's feeding us, and you thought he wasn't friendly." Obviously that fish thinks that the cat is friendly, but you, the reader, know that cats normally eat fish. Another great example of dramatic irony is that's used often in movies is horror movies, where you, the audience, knows that the killer is in the next room, but for some reason the character in the story does not. And so normally that character in that story will do something stupid, and you're shouting at the TV, no, don't go in there. And so that's dramatic irony, where you, the reader, you, the audience, know something that a character in the story does not know. So our last type of irony is situational irony. And this is probably one of the more common types of irony, but this is also the type of irony that a lot of people miss. And so situational irony is when an event occurs that goes against expectations that have been built up. And the best way to show you what I mean is with an example. And I'll let the Looney Tune cartoon look back around. So when Wile E. Coyote throws that rock, we expect him to go flying into the air because he's created like a little catapult for himself. But instead, the rock goes through the ground, and he slides on and falls, not to his doom, because Looney Tunes apparently can't die, but he does fall and make another imprint on the ground. So it looks like he's failed already once before. But situational irony is when you expect something to happen and then something completely different happens. Surprise endings are a great example of situational irony, when what you expect to happen at the end of a story does not actually happen. It doesn't go as planned. All right, so you should be pretty well acquainted with the different types of irony. You should be well acquainted with mood. And hopefully you now have a little bit of background knowledge that will help you better understand the Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. And so while you're reading, I want you to make sure that you look for examples of irony, because you will need to be able to discuss that with the rest of the class.